The city thrummed with its usual energy, a symphony of hurried footsteps, honking horns, and distant chatter. Among the bustling streets, Logan, a thoughtful 15-year-old with an eye for the unnoticed, navigated his way toward the restaurant where his father, David, worked as a head chef. Logan's pace was steady, his gaze sharp, taking in the blur of activity around him. He had always been observant, often catching the details that others missed. A discarded scarf on a bench, the first budding flowers on a neglected tree, or, in this case, a man leaning against the corner of a red brick building. The figure was older, his gray hair disheveled, his face etched with lines that hinted at struggles too deep to imagine. He clutched a crumpled paper cup in one hand, his other trembling slightly as he extended it toward the passing crowd. His clothes, worn and stained, spoke of a life that had once known better days. His soft, raspy voice carried a quiet plea, one barely audible above the city's relentless noise. "Please, just enough for a meal. It's been days." The world around him moved on, indifferent. Men in tailored suits and women, clutching shopping bags, strode past without so much as a glance. Their hurried lives seemed insulated from the quiet desperation of the man at the corner. But Logan, compelled by an instinct inherited from his father's generous spirit, paused. His bright, earnest eyes filled with concern as he stepped closer. "Hello, sir," Logan began gently, his voice cutting through the din of the street. "Can I help you?" The man looked up, his eyes dull with exhaustion, but flickering briefly with surprise at being acknowledged. I didn't think anyone would stop," he murmured, his voice heavy with gratitude and resignation. "What's your name?" Logan asked, crouching slightly to meet the man's gaze. "Ethan," the man replied with a faint, almost hesitant smile. Logan straightened, his mind already turning with possibilities. He knew the restaurant his father managed often had leftover meals, perfectly good food discarded due to policy, but capable of sustaining someone like Ethan for days. Logan's lips curved into a determined smile. "My name's Logan. Come with me. My dad works at a restaurant nearby. I'm sure we can figure something out." Ethan hesitated, his worn fingers gripping the cup tightly. "You think it won't be a bother? I don't want to cause trouble." "Not at all," Logan reassured him. "My dad always says food should never be wasted when there are people who need it. Let's go. It's not far." With a hint of hope returning to Ethan's weary expression, he reached for Logan's outstretched hand. Together, they walked toward the restaurant, their footsteps weaving through the crowd. Logan, sensing Ethan's lingering discomfort, began sharing stories about his father, his culinary talents, his belief in kindness, and his insistence on helping anyone in need. As they approached the restaurant, the sharp smells of freshly baked bread and sautéed herbs drifted through the air, blending with the faint hum of conversation. Logan felt a nervous excitement building in his chest. He was about to challenge the norms of the place, break the invisible rules, and involve his father in a decision that could change more than just Ethan's day. Unbeknownst to either of them, this small act of compassion would ripple outward, setting into motion a chain of events neither could foresee. A journey that would test their courage, reveal unexpected truths, and redefine the meaning of kindness in the face of adversity. The restaurant's rear entrance loomed ahead, a nondescript door marked by faint scratches and peeling paint, standing in stark contrast to the elegant facade that greeted paying customers. Logan glanced back at Ethan, whose hesitant steps betrayed his discomfort. "Wait here for a second," Logan said, gesturing toward a shaded spot near the wall. "I'll go get my dad. He'll know what to do." Ethan nodded, leaning against the wall as Logan disappeared inside. The muffled clatter of pots and the rhythmic hum of kitchen activity reached Ethan's ears, mixing with the faint aroma of freshly cooked meals. His stomach growled, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the kindness of a stranger who had seen him not as an inconvenience but as a human being in need. Inside, Logan wove through the bustling kitchen, sidestepping servers and cooks who moved like a well-oiled machine. His eyes scanned the room, searching for his father's familiar figure among the sea of white uniforms. "Has anyone seen David?" Logan asked, stopping by Kevin, a young cook organizing trays of freshly chopped vegetables. Kevin looked up from his work. He's in the storeroom, checking the inventory. Logan thanked him with a nod and hurried toward the back. The storeroom, lit by a harsh fluorescent bulb, smelled of spices and fresh produce. David, a sturdy man with graying hair and an air of quiet authority, stood near a shelf, meticulously counting boxes of herbs. "Dad," Logan called, his voice tinged with urgency. David turned, immediately sensing something unusual. "What's wrong, son?" "There's a man outside," Logan began, his words spilling out in a rush. "His name is Ethan. He's starving, Dad. I thought maybe we could help him. You always say food shouldn't go to waste." David's face softened, his steady demeanor masking a twinge of concern. "Bring him in," he said after a moment's thought. "Let's see what we can do." Logan's relief was palpable as he dashed back outside to fetch Ethan. Together, they re-entered the restaurant through the back door. The kitchen's warm light and bustling activity were a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent streets they had just left. "Dad, this is Ethan," Logan said, introducing the older man. David extended a hand, his expression kind yet appraising. "Ethan, welcome. Let's get you something to eat." Ethan hesitated, his worn hands fidgeting with his tattered scarf. "I don't want to trouble you." "No trouble at all," David replied firmly. "Sit here." He gestured to a small bench near the prep area. As Ethan sat, David selected a plate of mushroom risotto and roasted chicken from the surplus meals, perfectly good dishes that couldn't be served the next day due to restaurant standards. Handing the plate to Ethan, David offered a smile. "Eat. Everyone deserves a hot meal." Ethan's hands trembled as he accepted the food. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Nearby, Logan watched his father with admiration, but his heart was heavy with a nagging worry. He knew this act of kindness, however small, could lead to trouble if certain people found out. As Ethan ate, savoring every bite, the kitchen continued to hum with activity. But Logan's unease proved well-founded when the sharp voice of Frank, the restaurant manager, echoed across the room. "David!" David straightened, his calm expression unchanged as Frank approached, his arms crossed and his face clouded with irritation. "What's going on here?" Frank demanded, his eyes flicking to Ethan. David stepped forward, his tone measured. "He needed help, Frank." "I couldn't ignore that." Frank's scowl deepened. "We've talked about this, David. Feeding people off the streets. This isn't a soup kitchen. It's a business. You're jeopardizing our reputation." David's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "A reputation built on good food, not indifference. What's the harm in giving one man a meal from what would otherwise be thrown away?" Frank's eyes narrowed. "The harm is setting a precedent. If word gets out, we'll have a line of people at the back door expecting handouts." From the bench, Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his gratitude now mingled with guilt. Logan, standing beside his father, clenched his fists. "That's not fair," he blurted, his voice trembling with emotion. "Dad was just doing the right thing." Frank turned sharply toward Logan. "This is not your concern, young man. Stay out of it." David placed a hand on Logan's shoulder, a silent gesture to calm him. "Frank," David said firmly, "if helping someone in need is a problem, then maybe this isn't the right place for me." A tense silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the distant clang of a pot. Frank's expression hardened. "You're right. It's not. You're fired, David. Clean out your locker and leave immediately." Logan's heart sank as the weight of Frank's words settled over the room. Ethan lowered his gaze, his meal forgotten, while the kitchen staff exchanged uneasy glances. David removed his apron with deliberate calm, handing it to a stunned Kevin who stood nearby. Turning to Logan, he said softly, "Let's go, son." As they walked toward the exit, Ethan stood abruptly. "Wait," he called, his voice unsteady. I'm sorry. This is my fault. I didn't mean to cause trouble." David shook his head, his gaze steady. "It's not your fault, Ethan. Doing the right thing always comes with risks." Outside, the evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Logan walked in silence beside his father, his mind racing with anger, guilt, and determination. What do we do now, Dad? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David looked toward the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to pierce the twilight. We move forward, he said. Sometimes, losing one thing leads to finding something better. Ethan, walking a few steps behind them, spoke hesitantly. If there's anything I can do to help? David turned to him with a faint smile. You've already reminded us what's important. That's more than enough for now. Together, the three of them continued down the street, their paths intertwined by an act of kindness that had already begun to reshape their lives in ways none of them could yet foresee. The faint hum of the city faded behind them as David, Logan, and Ethan walked in the growing dusk, their footsteps carrying the weight of what had transpired. David's calm demeanor masked the storm brewing inside him. Logan kept stealing glances at his father, his young face etched with worry. Dad, Logan began tentatively, do you think Frank will? I mean, could he really stop us from doing what's right? David smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. People like Frank see kindness as weakness, son, but strength lies in doing what's right, no matter the cost. Ethan, walking a step behind, hesitated before speaking. I never meant for you to lose your job. If I had known. David turned, his voice firm but kind. Ethan, don't carry this burden. The choice was mine, and I'd make it again in a heartbeat. A job is temporary. Principles last a lifetime. Despite David's words, tension hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Unbeknownst to them, seeds of betrayal were already taking root. Back at the restaurant, Kevin, the young cook who had overheard the altercation, lingered near Frank's office. Kevin's ambition burned quietly but fiercely. He had always envied David's position as head chef, admiring his skill but resenting his unwavering principles. Now, with David gone, Kevin saw an opportunity to ascend. Frank, seated at his desk with a scowl etched into his face, glanced up as Kevin knocked lightly on the door. What is it? I thought you'd want to know, Kevin said, his voice steady despite the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. David's actions, they weren't a one-time thing. He's been doing this for months, sneaking food to people outside. It's not good for the restaurant's reputation. Frank leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Is that so? Kevin nodded, suppressing the guilt rising in his chest. I thought you should know. I'm committed to keeping things running smoothly here. Frank studied Kevin for a long moment, then smirked. You're ambitious, aren't you? I just want what's best for the restaurant, Kevin replied carefully. Good, Frank said, tapping his pen against the desk. With David gone, there's room for someone who understands the business side of things. Let's see what you can do. As Kevin left the office, his stomach churned. He had achieved what he wanted, but at what cost? Far from the restaurant's polished interior, David, Logan, and Ethan found themselves in a small diner tucked into the corner of a quiet street. The warm glow of the lights and the clinking of cups provided a brief reprieve from the day's chaos. David sipped his coffee thoughtfully while Logan picked at a slice of pie, his appetite diminished by the events of the evening. Ethan, despite his hunger, hesitated before eating the simple sandwich in front of him, his hands still trembling. Ethan, David began, breaking the silence, tell me about yourself. How did you end up here? Ethan sighed, the weight of years visible in his posture. I wasn't always like this, he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. I had a family once. A daughter, Diana. She was my world. Logan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. What happened? Ethan hesitated, his gaze distant. It all fell apart when I trusted the wrong people. A man named Edward. He called himself my friend. He convinced me to invest everything I had into what turned out to be a scam. It wasn't just money I lost. Diana believed in him too. She lost her savings, her home, and eventually, her life. Ethan's voice broke on the last word, and David placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, David said softly. I tried to move on, Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But losing everything shows you who truly cares. Turns out, not many people do. Logan exchanged a glance with his father, who nodded subtly. Ethan, David said firmly, you cared enough to keep going. That counts for something. And now, maybe it's time to turn the page. As the conversation deepened, an idea began to take shape in David's mind. He straightened in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I can't go back to the restaurant," he said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we stop here. There's more than one way to help people. Ethan, if you're willing, I think we can work together to make something new, something better." Ethan looked up, surprised. "You'd want me to help? After everything?" "Absolutely," David replied. "You've seen both sides of life. You know what people need, and I have the skills to make it happen. Logan and I will figure out the rest." Logan, his eyes lighting up for the first time that evening, grinned. "We could start something together, maybe a food truck or a community kitchen. Something for people like Ethan, Dad." Ethan's face softened, a glimmer of hope returning to his tired eyes. "I don't know if I can repay you." "You don't need to," David said simply. "Helping others is repayment enough." As the three of them sat in the quiet diner, ideas flowing between them, the air seemed lighter. Outside, the rain began to fall gently, washing the city in a silvery sheen. It was as if the night itself was offering a kind of cleansing, a promise of renewal. What had started as a single act of kindness was now evolving into something far greater. David, Logan, and Ethan were united by circumstance but driven by a shared purpose. To build a new beginning, not just for themselves but for the countless others who had been forgotten by a world too busy to notice. The rain had stopped by the time David, Logan, and Ethan left the diner, but the city's streets glistened under the glow of streetlights. A renewed sense of purpose carried them forward, yet David's mind churned with unease. He knew standing up to Frank and his associate, Edward, would be no easy task. "Dad," Logan asked as they walked, his voice tinged with determination, "what's our first step? We can't just let them get away with what they've done." David glanced at his son, proud of his courage but aware of the risks ahead. "We need evidence," he said firmly. "If Frank and Edward are as corrupt as I suspect, their secrets are buried in that restaurant. The truth has to come to light, but we have to be smart about this." Ethan, walking a step behind, hesitated before speaking. "If there's anything I can do to help, I will. I owe you both that much." David turned, his gaze steady. "We'll need you, Ethan. You've seen the kind of damage they can cause. Together, we'll find a way to expose them." The trio began to sketch a plan. With the restaurant closed for the night, they decided to return early the next morning, when the staff was minimal. David, having worked there for years, knew every corridor and locked cabinet. The city was quiet in the early hours, its usual chaos replaced by a tentative calm. David and Logan, dressed in dark jackets to blend into the shadows, approached the restaurant's back entrance with Ethan trailing behind. David fished an old key from his pocket, one he had forgotten to return after his dismissal. The lock clicked softly, and they slipped inside, their movements cautious and deliberate. The kitchen, once a lively hub, now stood silent. David motioned for Logan to follow him toward the manager's office while Ethan remained by the door, keeping watch. Inside the office, David's sharp eyes scanned the room. Filing cabinets, a cluttered desk, and a safe mounted in the corner. It was all familiar, yet he saw it now with new purpose. "Look for anything that might connect Frank and Edward to illegal activities," David instructed, his voice a low whisper. Logan opened drawers carefully, sorting through papers. "Dad, over here," he said, pulling out a folder labeled confidential. Inside were emails and financial records that hinted at shady deals and unexplained transactions. "This is what we need," David murmured, slipping the folder into his bag. "But there's more. If we can access the security cameras, we might find even stronger evidence." The two moved toward the office computer, David's hands flying over the keyboard as he navigated the system. Logan kept an eye on the door, his heart pounding with every faint sound. "Got it," David said, pulling a USB drive from his pocket and starting the transfer. The progress bar moved agonizingly slowly. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Logan tensed. "Dad, someone's coming." David cursed under his breath. "We need this file. Stall them if you can." Logan stepped into the hallway just as Kevin appeared, his face a mix of suspicion and surprise. What are you doing here? Kevin demanded. I was looking for my dad, Logan stammered, feigning confusion. He left something in his locker. Kevin's eyes narrowed. Your dad was fired. He's not supposed to be here. I know, but he told me to grab his stuff. I didn't think it'd be a big deal, Logan said, trying to sound nonchalant. Kevin hesitated, clearly torn. Before he could press further, the sound of the office door clicking shut drew his attention. Wait here, Kevin said sharply, moving toward the office. Inside, David had finished the transfer just in time. As Kevin reached for the doorknob, David slipped out through a side exit, motioning for Logan to follow him. Back at the diner, the three men reviewed the evidence. David connected the USB to his laptop, and the screen lit up with damning footage. Frank and Edward in the manager's office, laughing about forged documents and laundered money. Ethan watched the screen with growing anger. That's him, he said, his voice shaking. That's Edward, the man who ruined my life. Logan clenched his fists. We have to take this to the authorities. David nodded. We will, but we need to prepare. People like Frank and Edward don't go down without a fight. As they discussed their next move, Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. There's something I haven't told you, he said quietly. I used to know Edward's father, James. He was the one who orchestrated the scams that destroyed me and my daughter. David and Logan exchanged a glance. If James is still involved, David said, this goes deeper than we thought. We'll need more than just this footage. We need to connect the dots between all of them. The trio spent the next few hours piecing together their plan. David would reach out to an old friend in law enforcement, someone he trusted to handle the evidence. Logan would monitor the restaurant, keeping an eye on Frank's and Kevin's movements. Ethan, drawing on his own knowledge of James and Edward's operations, would help identify the weak points in their network. As they worked, a sense of determination settled over them. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice for Diana, for those who had suffered, and for the integrity of their own principles. The morning sun crept over the horizon as David, Logan, and Ethan finalized their preparations. Armed with the incriminating footage and documents, David reached out to Detective Harris, a retired law enforcement officer who had once been a regular at the restaurant. Harris had earned David's trust over the years with his unshakable integrity and belief in second chances. Harris listened carefully as David explained everything. This isn't just about Frank and Edward, David concluded. It's about stopping a cycle of exploitation and corruption. Harris nodded, his weathered face grim. I'll take the evidence to the precinct and push for an official investigation. But you should know, these men won't go down quietly. You need to be prepared for backlash. David exchanged a glance with Logan and Ethan. We're ready, he said firmly. 2 days later, Harris informed David that Frank and Edward would be attending a gala at James's mansion, an event filled with the city's elite. It's the perfect place to expose them, Harris said. But we need more. Something irrefutable that ties James into this. Ethan's expression hardened. James will have everything we need in his private office. That man's arrogance won't let him destroy anything incriminating. That evening, the trio infiltrated the gala disguised as waitstaff. The mansion was a spectacle of opulence, its grand hall sparkling with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Guests mingled, their laughter masking the tension brewing beneath the surface. David carried a tray of hors d'oeuvres, his eyes scanning the room for James, Frank, and Edward. Logan moved discreetly toward the office while Ethan, now unrecognizable in a tailored suit, blended seamlessly into the crowd. As Logan slipped into the office, his heart pounded. The room was filled with ornate furniture, and a massive oak desk dominated the space. Quickly, he began photographing documents and searching for hidden compartments. Meanwhile, in the hall, Ethan approached James. The older man's confident demeanor faltered when he recognized Ethan. Ethan, James said, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. I didn't expect to see you here. Surprised? Ethan replied coldly, his voice steady. You shouldn't be. I've waited a long time for this moment. Their exchange was cut short by the sudden arrival of the police. Blue and red lights flashed outside, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Guests froze as officers entered the mansion, led by Detective Harris. James Carter, Frank Mills, and Edward Daniels, Harris announced, his voice echoing through the hall. You are under arrest for multiple counts of financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. James's composed facade cracked. This is absurd, he roared. You have no proof. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. Oh, but we do. You built your empire on lies, James. And now the truth is finally catching up to you. As James, Frank, and Edward were led away in handcuffs, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Guests exchanged shocked glances, their polished appearances doing little to hide their unease. Outside, Ethan stood beneath the mansion's grand awning, the cool night air carrying a sense of closure he hadn't felt in years. David and Logan joined him, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. It's over, Logan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not quite, Harris interjected as he approached. This is just the beginning. The trial will be long, and they'll fight every step of the way. But you've done the hardest part. You've brought the truth to light. Ethan looked at David, gratitude evident in his eyes. I couldn't have done this without you. Both of you. David shook his head. We all played our part. And now it's time to focus on what's next. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the arrests sent shockwaves through the city. The trial revealed the full extent of James's, Frank's, and Edward's schemes, uncovering years of fraud and manipulation. Public sentiment turned sharply against them, and the once powerful trio faced the consequences of their actions. With his name cleared and his assets restored, Ethan decided to reopen the restaurant he had lost years ago. But this time, it would be different. At a small ceremony marking the restaurant's reopening, Ethan stood before a crowd of supporters, including David, Logan, and Detective Harris. This place represents a second chance, not just for me, but for everyone who walks through these doors. It's proof that even in the darkest times, there's hope for redemption. He turned to David and Logan. And to ensure that this vision lives on, I'm entrusting the restaurant to the two people who taught me the true meaning of compassion. David and Logan stepped forward, overwhelmed by Ethan's generosity. We'll make this a place where everyone feels welcome, David promised. Logan added with a smile, and we'll never forget what it stands for. The reopening of the restaurant marked a turning point not just for Ethan, David, and Logan, but for the entire community. The once stiff, high-end establishment had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space where everyone, regardless of their circumstances, was invited to dine. The exterior now bore a new sign, Second Chances Café, a name chosen to reflect its mission. Inside, the restaurant was abuzz with activity. The polished hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting, and the air was filled with the rich aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering herbs. The walls displayed art from local students and photographs of community events, a testament to the cafe's commitment to inclusivity. David moved through the kitchen like a conductor leading an orchestra. His instructions were calm but precise, guiding the young staff with a patience honed through years of experience. Most of the new hires were individuals who had struggled to find stable work, former homeless individuals, young adults aging out of foster care, and even a few ex-convicts looking for a fresh start. Remember, David said, addressing the staff during a quiet moment, every dish we serve is an opportunity to show someone kindness. That's what this place is about. Meanwhile, Logan managed the front of the house, his energy infectious as he greeted customers and ensured everything ran smoothly. His youth and determination brought a fresh perspective, and he was already organizing the cafe's first community event, a pay-it-forward night where meals would be free for anyone in need. Ethan, now a familiar presence in the cafe, often sat by the window with a cup of coffee, observing the bustling activity with quiet pride. Though he had handed over the reins to David and Logan, he remained deeply involved, mentoring staff and sharing his story to inspire others. One afternoon, Mrs. Ramirez, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, arrived at the cafe with her granddaughter, Sophia. Mrs. Ramirez, who had been wary of the changes in the area, was skeptical of the cafe's mission. Why would anyone give away meals for free? She asked Logan as he seated them. Because everyone deserves to feel cared for, Logan replied with a smile. And sometimes, a meal is the first step toward hope. As Mrs. Ramirez and Sophia enjoyed their meal, they noticed a man in a tattered coat sitting a few tables away. He was greeted warmly by David, who served him a steaming bowl of soup and fresh bread. Watching the interaction, Mrs. Ramirez's skepticism began to melt away. Later that evening, as the cafe closed, Mrs. Ramirez approached Logan. "This place, it's special," she admitted, her voice soft. "It reminds me of what this neighborhood used to be, people looking out for each other." Logan's smile widened. "That's exactly what we're trying to bring back." The cafe's influence grew rapidly. Word spread not only about its delicious food, but also about its heartwarming mission. Community members began to rally around the cafe, offering donations, volunteering their time, and attending its events. One of the cafe's most impactful initiatives was its Cooking for Change program. Led by David, the program offered free culinary training to young adults from underprivileged backgrounds. Participants learned not only how to cook, but also how to manage a kitchen, preparing them for careers in the food industry. One of the program's standout participants was Monica, a shy but determined 19-year-old who had been living in a shelter. Under David's mentorship, Monica flourished, her natural talent for baking quickly becoming evident. "Monica's pastries are the highlight of every morning," Logan teased one day as he bit into a flaky croissant. Monica blushed but smiled. "I never thought I'd be doing this. I used to think I didn't have a future." "You're proving every day that you do," David said warmly. "And the cafe is better because of you." The cafe's success also brought unexpected opportunities. Local businesses began partnering with Second Chances Café, donating surplus ingredients and sponsoring community events. Even Kevin, the disgraced chef who had once betrayed David, reached out. When Kevin arrived at the cafe, he was visibly nervous. "David," he said, his voice trembling, "I came to apologize. What I did was wrong, and I've regretted it every day since." David studied Kevin for a long moment before replying. "Kevin, it takes courage to admit your mistakes. If you're serious about turning over a new leaf, there's a place for you here." Kevin's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd give me a second chance?" David smiled. "That's what this cafe is all about." As the weeks turned into months, the cafe's impact deepened. Logan's Pay It Forward Night became a monthly tradition, drawing crowds from all walks of life. The walls of the cafe filled with thank you notes from patrons whose lives had been touched by its generosity. One day, Ethan called a meeting with David and Logan. "I've been thinking," he began. "We've accomplished so much here, but there are so many other places that need what we've built. What if we expanded, opened a second location?" Logan's eyes lit up. "We could take everything we've learned here and bring it to another neighborhood." David nodded thoughtfully. "It's ambitious, but I think we're ready. Let's do it." With renewed purpose, the trio began planning the next chapter of their journey. The cafe's mission, born from an act of kindness, now had the potential to transform even more lives. The decision to expand Second Chances Café was met with both excitement and apprehension. While the first location had flourished, opening a second cafe brought new challenges. David, Logan, and Ethan spent weeks scouting neighborhoods that could benefit most from their mission. They finally settled on a struggling district on the city's outskirts, where poverty and neglect had left a palpable mark. The new location was an abandoned diner with peeling paint and broken windows, but David saw its potential. "This place has good bones," he said, running his hand along the counter. "With some work, it'll feel like home." The renovation process was grueling. The trio enlisted the help of volunteers, including staff from the original cafe and members of the community. Monica, now a full-time pastry chef, became a driving force, organizing bake sales to raise funds for equipment. Even Kevin, eager to prove his loyalty, contributed long hours to the restoration. Despite their best efforts, obstacles arose. Securing permits delayed progress, and initial skepticism from local residents cast a shadow over their work. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit diner, exhaustion etched on their faces, Logan voiced the doubt that had been building within him. "Dad, what if this doesn't work? What if people don't trust us?" David placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Logan, the first cafe wasn't easy either. But we didn't give up then, and we won't give up now. People will see our intentions through our actions. Ethan, sitting across from them, added, every step forward is a step toward change. We've seen it before, and we'll see it again. After months of tireless effort, the second cafe, named New Horizons Café, was ready. The grand opening drew a mix of curious locals, volunteers, and supporters from the original location. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as David and Ethan welcomed guests at the door, while Logan and Monica worked behind the counter. Among the first customers was Mr. Alvarez, a retired factory worker who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He approached David cautiously, his weathered face skeptical. "What's the catch?" he asked gruffly. "No catch," David replied with a warm smile. "Just good food and a place where everyone is welcome." Mr. Alvarez studied David for a moment before nodding. "We'll see." As the day unfolded, the cafe began to fill with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of dishes. Logan organized a storytelling session for children, while Ethan shared his journey with patrons, encouraging them to see the cafe as a source of hope. By the end of the day, even Mr. Alvarez was smiling. "This place reminds me of the diner my wife and I used to visit," he told David. "I'll be back." The success of New Horizons Café proved that their mission had struck a chord. Over the next year, the two cafes became pillars of their respective communities, fostering connections and inspiring change. One day, as David and Logan walked through the original cafe, they noticed a young man sitting alone at a corner table. His clothes were worn, and his posture radiated exhaustion. David approached with a plate of food and a kind smile. "Welcome," he said, setting the plate down. "I'm David. Let me know if you need anything." The young man looked up, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. "I haven't eaten a proper meal in days." As David returned to the counter, Logan joined him. "Dad, every time I see something like that, it reminds me of how we started. With Ethan." "With one meal." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a reminder that change begins with small acts of kindness. That's what Second Chances is all about." At the end of the year, the team hosted a community celebration to honor the cafe's journey. Ethan, now a community advocate, gave a heartfelt speech, thanking David and Logan for their unwavering commitment. "This cafe didn't just save me. It gave me a purpose," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And it's given so many others a second chance at life. That's a legacy worth building on." The celebration ended with the unveiling of a new initiative, a scholarship fund for young adults pursuing careers in culinary arts, funded by donations and cafe profits. As the evening drew to a close, Logan stood beside his father, looking out at the bustling cafe. "Do you think we'll open more locations one day?" he asked. David smiled, his gaze filled with quiet pride. "One step at a time, son. We'll keep moving forward, just like we always have." Under the cafe's warm lights, surrounded by the hum of laughter and conversation, their journey felt far from over. It was a story still unfolding, one meal, one second chance at a time.